In the year 100 of the Common Era, an Aksumite merchant loading goods onto a ship at the port of Adulis, in what is now Eritrea, needed no passport to trade with India, Arabia, Persia, or Rome. No visa, no application form, no document to prove his right to be present in a foreign port. He needed cargo, a vessel, knowledge of the monsoon winds, and relationships with merchants at the other end. In 2026, a citizen of Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, one of the world's largest economies, holds a passport that allows visa-free access to 44 countries. A citizen of France can enter 190 countries without prior approval. The gap between those two numbers, 44 and 190, is not a gap in economics alone. It is a gap in freedom of movement, in the documented, measurable freedom to go somewhere. This episode is not an argument about immigration policy. What happens at borders today is a matter of politics, law, and active international debate, and this channel is not going to take sides in that debate. But there is a historical observation, specific, documented, and archaeology-backed, that almost nobody makes when those debates are held. The modern passport system is approximately 100 years old. It was formalized internationally after the First World War, primarily by European states seeking to control the movement of people across the borders their wars had destabilized. Before that system existed, the concept of needing a document from your own government to enter a foreign country was, for most of human history, the exception rather than the rule. And before it existed, for 2,000 years of documented history, African merchants, diplomats, and scholars moved through the ancient world with exactly the same freedom as everyone else. Aksumite traders carried Ethiopian gold coins inscribed in Greek to the markets of India. Mali's emperor walked into Cairo and crashed its gold economy. Swahili merchants from the East African coast traded porcelain and gold with Chinese fleets that docked at their harbors. African scholars traveled to study in Cairo and returned home with libraries. The question this episode asks is simple and factual. What did that ancient African global connectivity actually look like? And when did the walls go up? Before I continue, if you enjoy topics like this, a like and a subscribe genuinely goes a long way for a channel like this. Thank you. There is a persistent image in Western popular culture of the pre-colonial African as essentially static, living in the same village, on the same land, generation after generation, until the European arrived with his ship and his map and connected the continent to the wider world. It is an image so thoroughly embedded in the way African history has been taught that many people treat it as obvious rather than as the historical claim it actually is. It is also, when tested against the archaeological and documentary evidence, straightforwardly wrong. Let us deal first with the myth's surface logic that European explorers were exceptional in their willingness to travel far from home, while Africans were not. The explorer narrative, Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, Cook, frames European expansion as a uniquely bold human achievement, implicitly contrasting it with the supposed passivity of the peoples they encountered. The version of history that says the Europeans discovered Africa is, in this framing, also saying something about African initiative. But what this narrative requires you to ignore is that when da Gama arrived on the East African coast in 1498, he did not find people who had never seen a foreign ship. He found the Swahili city-states, sophisticated urban port cities whose merchants had been trading with Arabia, Persia, India, and China for 5 centuries. He needed local navigators to guide him across the Indian Ocean because local people knew those waters and he did not. The people he discovered knew the world he was supposedly introducing them to rather better than he did. The question of whether ancient Africans explored in the European romantic sense, setting off for unknown lands, planting flags, and claiming discoveries, is the wrong question. The right question is, did ancient Africans travel internationally, trade internationally, maintain diplomatic relations internationally, and build knowledge of the wider world? The answer to every one of those questions is, emphatically, yes. They simply did not frame it as exploration. They framed it as commerce, and commerce, it turns out, takes you further than conquest. The oldest documented evidence of organized African maritime trade that we have comes from Egypt, and it is approximately 3,500 years old. Around 1470 BCE, Queen Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty dispatched a fleet of 5 ships to a place the Egyptians called Punt, a trading partner in the Horn of Africa, in what is now Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, or Somalia. This was not the first such voyage. The oldest recorded Egyptian expedition to Punt dates to approximately 2450 BCE, 45 centuries ago. For over 1,000 years, Egypt conducted regular, organized, state-funded maritime trade missions to East Africa, returning with frankincense, myrrh, living trees, ivory, and gold. Hatshepsut had the entire voyage carved into the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, the most detailed visual record of an ancient maritime trade expedition civilization that survives anywhere in the world. You can visit those carvings today. The ships are there, the Puntite leaders presenting goods are there, the trees being carefully loaded with their roots intact, the first documented successful transplanting of foreign plants in history are there. These voyages were not one way. Puntite goods arrived in Egypt, Egyptian goods arrived in Punt. This was bilateral commerce between two African civilizations, conducted across open ocean 4,000 years before the European age of exploration, not exploration, trade. The philosopher Mani, founder of Manichaeism in the 3rd century CE, wrote a list of the world's 4 great powers: Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. He was not speaking metaphorically. Aksum, in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, was a genuine superpower of the ancient world, and its power was built on trade. The key was geography. Aksum's Red Sea port city of Adulis sat at the intersection of the world's busiest trade corridor. Every ship moving goods between Rome and India, carrying Roman gold and glass westward, Indian spices and silk eastward, passed through or near Adulis. Aksum taxed it, regulated it, and enriched itself from it. Roman emperors corresponded directly with Aksumite kings. Aksumite gold coins have been found by archaeologists in India. Physical evidence of Aksumite merchants trading on the subcontinent recovered from the soil of South Asia. Aksum was also one of only 4 civilizations in the ancient world to mint its own coins, alongside Rome, Persia, and the Kushana Empire of India. The gold coins were inscribed in Greek, the international commercial language, for use in foreign trade. The silver and bronze were inscribed in Ge'ez for domestic use. Aksum operated a fully monetized, internationally integrated economy. The major Aksumite cities were cosmopolitan in the precise sense of the word. The city of Aksum itself had significant communities of Sabaean, Jewish, Indian, and Christian minorities, in addition to its Ethiopian majority. Ancient Aksum was not a closed, isolated place. It was a meeting point, by design, by trade strategy, and by the deliberate policy of rulers who understood that international commerce required international openness. Now consider the modern figure. The contemporary Ethiopian passport allows visa-free access to approximately 50 countries. The modern citizen of the country that once commanded the trade routes between Rome and India, that once minted coins accepted across 3 continents, must apply in advance to visit most of the world. To be clear, this is not a simple comparison across incomparable eras. The modern visa system is a different kind of institution, ancient commercial network. But the factual contrast between the mobility of Aksumite merchants in the 1st century and the mobility of Ethiopian passport holders in the 21st is documented on both ends, and it is stark. Along Africa's eastern coast, from Somalia south through Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, a network of city-states operated one of the most sophisticated commercial civilizations in the medieval world. The Swahili coast city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, Zanzibar, Sofala, and Mogadishu. These were substantial urban centers built in coral stone, governed by elected sultans, and oriented entirely toward international trade. The Swahili merchants understood the Indian Ocean monsoon system, the annual shift in wind direction that makes reliable open ocean sailing possible, and had been using it commercially for centuries before European navigators understood it existed. Between October and March, the northeast monsoon brought ships from Arabia and India toward Africa. Between April and September, the southwest monsoon blew them back. The Swahili world organized its entire commercial calendar around these winds. What the archaeology of the Swahili coast reveals is extraordinary. Chinese Song dynasty ceramics, dating to the 10th through 13th centuries, have been found at Swahili coastal sites, confirming trade with China 300 years before Zheng He's famous voyages. Persian glazed pottery appears from the 9th century, and at Great Zimbabwe, the great stone-walled city in the interior of modern Zimbabwe, over 1,000 miles from the sea, archaeologists have recovered Chinese porcelain. Specific, identified Longquan Celadon and Jingdezhen blue and white, dated to the 14th and 15th centuries. Chinese ceramics in the interior of southern Africa were traded through a continent-spanning network that linked the gold mines of Zimbabwe to the kilns of Fujian province. The Swahili merchants who made this possible were not passive recipients of foreign trade. They were active participants, travelers, and initiators. Swahili ships sailed to Arabia. Swahili merchants established communities in Indian port cities. Swahili diplomatic envoys attended the Chinese imperial court. The Indian Ocean world of the medieval period was a multilateral commercial network in which East African merchants held a central and active role, not because anyone invited them in, but because they had been building it for centuries. Mansa Musa's 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca and the inflation crisis in Cairo's gold market that his generosity accidentally triggered is one of the best-known stories in medieval African history. But what is less often discussed is that Musa's Hajj pilgrimage was not merely a religious journey. It was the culmination of a decade of deliberate international diplomatic engagement. Long before the 1324 pilgrimage, Mansa Musa had sent ambassadors to Morocco, to Egypt, and to the Mamluk court. His court officials, known as Faba, managed a network of diplomatic relationships across the Islamic world, securing trade routes, gathering intelligence, and projecting Mali's power without the need for military force. Musa was, in the modern sense, conducting international relations. He had foreign policies. On the pilgrimage itself, Timbuktu scholars traveled with him, and some stayed on in Cairo and Mecca, studying at Islamic institutions of learning and returning to Mali with knowledge. Others came the other way. Musa recruited the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili from Granada to return with him to Mali, paying him an extraordinary fee in gold to design the Great Mosque at Timbuktu and other buildings. This was not passive reception of foreign influence. It was active international recruitment, a West African ruler headhunting a Spanish architect in Egypt. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, produced by a European cartographer, depicts Mansa Musa at the center of the known world, holding a gold nugget with a caption identifying him as the richest ruler on earth. Medieval European map makers did not put someone at the center of their world map because he was isolated or unknown. They put him there because every merchant and diplomat in the Mediterranean world knew who he was. Mali was not on the margins of the medieval world. In 1375, it was arguably its economic center. Today, a citizen of Mali holds a passport that allows visa-free access to approximately 56 countries. The descendants of the ruler that European cartographers placed at the center of their world map must apply for permission to visit most of it. At Timbuktu's height, in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, it was one of the most important centers of Islamic learning in the world. The three great mosque universities, Sankore, Jinguerebe, and Sidi Yahya, a student population estimated at up to 25,000. Libraries hold hundreds of thousands of manuscripts in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, history, and Quranic interpretation. What made Timbuktu an intellectual capital was not merely the quality of its scholarship. It was the freedom of movement that allowed that scholarship to happen. Scholars came from across North Africa, from the Arabian Peninsula, from Andalusian Spain, from Egypt. They traveled to Timbuktu because Timbuktu had libraries they wanted to access and teachers they wanted to study with. And Timbuktu's own scholars traveled in return to Cairo, to Mecca, to Fez, to the scholarly centers of the wider Islamic world, and came back with manuscripts, with ideas, with networks. Ahmed Baba, Timbuktu's most celebrated intellectual, wrote over 70 works in Arabic. When Moroccan forces invaded and captured him in 1591, they took him to Marrakesh. He spent years there, debating with Moroccan scholars, teaching at the Sultan's court, demanding his freedom. Even as a captive, he was a participant in an international intellectual conversation that spanned the continent. His lament when captured was not that his freedom of movement had been taken. It was that they had stolen 1,600 of his books, the smallest library, he said, of any of his friends. This was a world in which African intellectual life was continental in its reach and cosmopolitan in its connections. Scholars moved between Timbuktu and Cairo as contemporary academics move between universities, following knowledge, following teachers, following manuscripts. The idea that pre-colonial Africa was intellectually or geographically self-contained is not merely false, it is the opposite of what the documentary evidence shows. The ancient African global trade network, the one that carried Chinese porcelain to Zimbabwe, Aksumite coins to India, and Timbuktu scholars to Cairo, did not disappear because Africa became less connected or less capable. It was disrupted by a sequence of external interventions, each of which progressively restricted African freedom of movement. The first intervention was the Portuguese arrival on the East African coast in the late 15th century. The Indian Ocean Commercial Network had operated for over 1,000 years as a relatively open system. Multiple players, multiple routes, and mutual access. Vasco da Gama's 1498 voyage was the opening move in a Portuguese strategy to seize control of this network by force, using cannon-armed warships to blockade Arab and Swahili traders and force the lucrative spice trade through Portuguese-controlled routes. The Swahili city-states were bombarded, sacked, and placed under Portuguese military authority. The commercial freedom of the Indian Ocean was converted, within decades, into a Portuguese monopoly. The Atlantic slave trade, which we have covered at length in this this series simultaneously drained the West African interior of millions of people whose labor, skills, and social networks would have been the foundation of domestic economic development. The loss of population, estimated at 12 to 13 million people transported across the Atlantic over 3 centuries, directly suppressed the kind of merchant class, urban economy, and commercial infrastructure that sustained ancient Timbuktu and the Swahili coast. Then came the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, at which European powers divided Africa among themselves without a single African representative present. The borders drawn in Berlin did not follow existing trade routes, language groups, or political structures. They cut across them, severing commercial networks, separating peoples, and creating the political geography that African countries inherited at independence and that still defines their passport categories today. And then, in 1920, came the modern passport. The League of Nations Conference on Passports standardized the document that would, for the first time in human history, make a government's permission a universal prerequisite for international travel. The freedom of movement that ancient Aksumite merchants had exercised as a matter of course, sailing to India with goods and returning with payment, became, within a generation, a document that required state approval to exercise. The passport system was not designed to restrict African movement specifically. It was designed to control the chaotic movement of populations across Europe's war-damaged borders. But the system was implemented at the exact moment when Africa was under colonial rule, which meant that African passports were issued from the beginning by colonial administrations that had no interest in facilitating the international mobility of the people they were occupying. The structural disadvantage was built in from the first stamp. Let us hold the full picture. For 2,000 years of documented history, from Hatshepsut's Punt voyages to the Swahili coast's medieval trade with China, African merchants, diplomats, and scholars moved through the ancient world with the same freedom of commerce as everyone else. They needed knowledge, goods, ships, and relationships. They did not need permission. The system that now restricts the movement of African passport holders, the visa regime, the passport stratification, the requirement for prior government approval to cross a border, is approximately 100 years old. It was standardized at a moment when Africa was under colonial occupation. It was designed by the same states that had, in the preceding century, systematically dismantled the commercial and political structures that had sustained African international connectivity for 2 millennia. This episode does not tell you what policy conclusions to draw from that history. Reasonable people disagree about how borders should work, who should cross them, and under what conditions. What this episode does do is give you the historical baseline that those debates almost never include. Africa was globally connected long before the walls went up. The walls are recent. The history is longer. Tell me in the comments, what does the contrast with the present tell you about where the story goes from here? This is Kingdoms and Empires. The ancient world was always global. Africa was always at its center, and the evidence is still there, in the soil of India, in the walls of Zimbabwe, in the manuscripts of Timbuktu, waiting for the history books to catch up.